Maclennan, and I'm speaking to you from Nova Scotia. I'm surrounded by mist. Well, the mist may be inside my head because this is a very complex set of issues we're going to discuss this morning, but I suspect it's in the wider environment round about me. This is the second of 3 sessions looking at the importance of taking a systems perspective in understanding how housing functions, housing systems function, and the way in which we need to think about governing it more effectively, along with increased rights, increased resources. They'll be necessary but not sufficient to reach the kind of housing objectives and indeed other big system objectives about productive economy, social inclusion, and indeed zero carbon, which I'll focus on today. That we're going to require some important shifts in the way we think about and actually govern housing policy. The first webinar looked at that set of issues in relation to the economy. We were interested in the questions of what drove the economy, but how it actually had a spatial structure across Canada, and it was a system of subsystems, if you like, and that system drivers and system policies at all levels interconnected with each other, so that one couldn't say that housing is primarily a social outcome, it's primarily driven by provincial policy and interest. That was just not true when it came to looking at the economy. We then, in a sense, identified what I think I'll call policy fractures, where key government departments who don't have housing as a primary responsibility, or may not necessarily even think through the implications of their policy actions for the housing system, in other words, unintended consequences. I think there are really significant policy fractures because in general, Canada doesn't think about the housing system. It thinks about specific affordable housing outcomes and meeting housing needs, quite understandably, and market stability too. But there are really significant policy fractures. We're now taking the question of the environment and zero carbon as a second theme, illustrating my contention that the inappropriate governance of housing, the inability to think in system terms about housing policy, is actually creating adverse housing outcomes and then significant further negative knock-on effects. So the approach here is similar. We look at the housing as a system. We think about housing not just as a set of activities of construction and sales and maintenance and whatever, but the set of housing attributes that are produced, the quality of a home, the nature of the systems within it. Is energy efficiency important in this case? Its location within a neighbourhood, also important in this case. Its location relative to a large number of household activity sites within rural regions and metropolitan areas, again, absolutely critical in the discussions about zero carbon. So housing is activity, housing is attributes and activities that have recursive effects on the economy, the environment, and the society. That's where we want to look at this. I think it's fairly evident that a systems approach is really important in looking at environmental issues. Indeed, people concerned with environmental management and indeed town planning professionals in the last 15 to 20 years have actually increasingly emphasized the fact that cities are systems, neighborhoods are systems. Ironically, I think that the way in which they've thought about housing within these urban and indeed neighborhood systems has been a little limited, and I'll come back to that later. But certainly the systems thinking approach is well established in looking at issues of environmental policy. So when we think about housing as an activity, as a set of attributes, clearly construction as an activity, it consumes nature. When you think of Anne Whiston-Spirn's classic volume in the 1980s of The Botanic Garden, talking about urbanization and its impact on micro ecosystems and indeed microclimates within urban areas. Housing's the biggest land use, or in a sense, replacement of nature within metropolitan areas. So clearly, the very act of constructing housing consumes nature. It also creates new ecosystems, but at the same time, it uses energy, it uses raw materials, and they all have carbon implications. Additionally, of course, building housing creates a built environment. And as I said, that creates different patterns of runoff, it creates different patterns of microclimates, but it also creates a visual environment that people enjoy or don't enjoy. And that's reflected in the structure of the housing market and the environments that people will pay to live in. And that in turn becomes important when thinking about just transitions. And I'll come back to that point later. Also, when a house is constructed, that is a particular structure, it's a particular design, and that is clearly going to impact not only all the ambient flows that emerge from a building, whether it's smoke, whether it's used water, wastewater, sewage, and so on. All these ambient flows that come are influenced by the nature of the home that individuals have. But clearly, the energy that's used in using the attributes of a house to produce housing services, in other words, the warmth, the comfort, the cool, not necessarily in Nova Scotia today, I may say, but the whole range of activities, cleaning the house, refrigeration, and so on, all the attributes of much of what goes on in the home, even connecting by broadband as we are today, is actually it reflected in the design and construction of the system. So building housing, what we build, the environment we build in the housing, all shapes environmental flows and the energy that we use in producing housing and related services. Of course, housing is located in a neighbourhood, and that's an important issue to come back to, but also where we choose to live or are required to live sets us in a location relative to the household activity points that we will use in our daily living, our household activity patterns. In other words, the home's location is absolutely critical in determining the mobility patterns, daily quotidian mobility patterns of every member of a household, and indeed the mode of transport they use and the energy that they use in that process. Too often that's just seen as a transport problem or a problem for the transport department. So it's a housing issue. It's where we build things. It's what density we build them at, and it's where what we actually build at particular places. So I think in the housing context, we have to take a more elaborate and a more thought through consideration of the environmental impacts and the environmental effects of the housing that we produce or the housing that we use. And actually, if you look at the policy statements of governments in relation to housing, they're still very much focused, as I said last time, on the social objectives, not very much on the economic objectives, and in many ways, surprisingly little on the environmental impacts of the housing decisions being made. Now, people may say that's captured in planning statements, it's captured in other things, but I think there's a strong case that any future route map or mission statement for housing has to be really explicit about what the environmental objectives and the carbon objectives of housing development or using housing in particular ways. We all recognize this as a problem that is, some people think existential, but certainly a problem that is one of the dominant problems of our times. I'm not sure that's reflected in the way in which we produce housing plans or housing expenditures or think about housing policy. And I think that we have to have collectively a wake-up call in that regard. So let's then think about how we move forward on this. There's been a recognition of, obviously, of the importance of environmental issues in the past, and also the issue of global warming. When we do that, we also re-emphasize the point that global warming arises from local actions. Again, it's this point about connections between systems and spatial systems at different levels. So again, if we're thinking about the right housing investment policies for Canada, we have to think about the environmental decisions taken at local scales and their regional impacts and their national impacts and their global impacts. In other words, we have to think local, but always think more than local. We needed to do that in the economic discussion. We need to do that in the context of the environmental discussion too. So we are dealing with the system in which the homes and neighbourhoods and indeed cities that we live in were really shaped and constructed for an era and in an era where fossil fuels dominated, at least for the last 150 years, and that would cover most construction existing housing stock in Canada. But we're now shifting to a perspective where we're saying that alignment of infrastructure and the way it's connected and the way it's used and the way that it's energized is no longer appropriate. And we have to think differently about how we will build, use, maintain, and connect the housing stock to meet the new objectives about zero carbon. I'm not in challenge. I think the importance of moving to net zero carbon is unchallengeable. What is challengeable is the ways that we do it and the timescales and the strategies. So the housing system is crucial in the net zero to focus in on our issue here in a number of key ways. How we build homes, what we construct, the size, the systems they include, their greenhouse gas propensities, if you like, where we build them and how we connect them, but also how we price them and organize them in ways that the costs of adverse effects from greenhouse gases and the costs of transition don't fall entirely or primarily or predominantly on lowest income groups. And in that regard, we have to think about the spatial social sorting of different income groups and poor people into the worst neighbourhoods. So when we begin to look at how we deal with that, this question is about technological change. And I do think that we have to recognise that in building construction and materials and a whole range of issues about energy systems, there's been an extraordinarily impressive development in technologies of residential heating and residential materials over the last 20 years. I think that there's a lot of encouraging things. It's easy to become rather gloomy in this area of work, but in fact, there has been a huge amount of technical progress. We also require behavioural change. That's much less evident in terms of people's propensities about size of homes and their sort of carbon-intensive fuels in approaches to a whole range of issues about how you adjust to these things and some of the fiscal instruments like carbon taxes that go round about them. So I think technological change, engineers have been well ahead of the rest of us in terms of making these adjustments. I would also argue very strongly that governance has to change. There are lots of departments and individuals in governments who know what this set of challenges is, but perhaps there's much less obvious is the extent to which the governance systems have changed to deal with the policy fractures that need to be overcome to actually face net zero carbon. So that gives us then three major issues to talk about fairly quickly, and I've dealt with as best I could in the third report, which is available on the website, but also summarised in the shorter Foundations 3 paper. The first of these, obviously, is construction. If you take a chain perspective on carbon use in construction, from looking at the materials to how they're assembled, to how what goes on site, to actual construction itself. About 25% of non-household carbon production in the Canadian economy is potentially attributable to construction activities. So that's a very significant and large total. In terms of residential energy use, the extent to which individuals use energy, it's about 1/6 of all energy use. And in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, residential use of energy creates about, different estimates suggest, between 13 and 17% of carbon emissions in the Canadian context. So this is the construction, residential energy, that's first two issues, are really important. But so also, from a housing point of view, is the fact that, again, about a fifth quarter of greenhouse gas emissions by households are in transportation. And that transportation isn't just about transport mode and transport choice. It's about where we put homes in relation to where people play, where they learn, and where they work. So it's a housing issue to be dealt with, or a housing and transport and infrastructure issue that needs to be more effectively dealt with. So let's very quickly look at whether or not there seems to be hopes in the Canadian context. Well, the first one on construction, and we do have the National Green Building Strategy, which I think has raised a lot of consciousness and promoted a lot of ideas. We also have a multiple range of approaches at different local levels, and some of the big cities in particular, of trying to decarbonize the construction activity, and actually do take that informed chain perspective, where we look at the materials that are using, and when we look at these chain perspectives, they also tell us what's beginning to make a difference in reducing carbon in construction. The first of these is there's been quite a lot of innovation in the materials that now use much less energy in the production of homes, if you like. In other words, there's more attention to using more local, more natural, and actually even in some renewal projects, more circular economy perspectives, although I suspect the construction sector as a whole could pay much more attention to the amount of waste that actually gets created in the way that things are designed and put in place. There's also major advances in more energy efficient machinery with less reliance on fossil fuels, and that either in bringing materials to the site or indeed workforce personnel to sites, and then in terms of how energy is used on site. So that effective construction operations and firms are already doing many of these things and taking them to a significant extent. There needs to be, I think, probably a bit more attention to what's actually built. There is evidence that if you produce modular homes and you're doing so much of the energy-related work at scale and in a controlled setting, that in that context, there is much more energy efficient as well as less costly and more flexible outcomes. So I think that dealing with net zero again points us to a much more detailed thinking about how we might develop modular housing in the Canadian context. So the policy goal of the Government of Canada in relation to carbon outputs or greenhouse gases from the construction sector is to actually reduce overall greenhouse gas production by 2030 and then almost moving towards net zero by 2040. And I think that's laudable. It is not, however, it's not a target of reducing net zero, carbon production per unit produced. And therein lies a worry, I think, for the next 5, possibly even 10 years, because we are actually talking about trying to decarbonize per unit of construction, and that may well happen, and it will happen. But at the same time, we're also talking about potentially doubling the size of the new construction sector and doing 500,000 retrofits per annum. Somewhere that doesn't add up, because that's going to boost significantly, unless the chains are decarbonised by half, if you like, almost in a 5-year period. That's actually going to produce more net carbon by 2030, with maybe some hope to reduce it by 2040. So there is, I think, a potential fracture in thinking in policy in there about the relationship between new supply, green aims, and immigration and retrofitting aims that needs to be explored. Let me turn to the question of residential energy emissions. Canada has the highest per capita energy use of any country in the OECD, and that's about a reflection of climate and structure of urban development. But in fact, if we look at the emissions per capita, it's much nearer the middle or average. In other words, very high emissions in relation to other OECD countries, but more effective use of non-fossil fuels than many other countries, at least about half of countries. Now, households, residential energy use arises because people use the attributes of their homes to produce these services I referred to earlier. Staying at home, watching the telly, being comfortable, preparing internet videos, whatever they do as activities in the home. And major technologies in reducing energy use within the home, the developments have been really quite spectacular, whether we're talking about passive housing, whether we're talking about some of the standards developed in BC and other parts of the country. But what we are seeing is significant reductions in energy consumption to actually deliver these household services. And we are also now seeing, because of that reduced energy consumption for these households, they are much more able to cope with the really significant rise in energy costs since 2022. I mean, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the reaction of OPEC to that in terms of oil pricing means that we're going to confront pretty high energy prices over quite a long period of time, so that the more energy efficient homes are, the less pursuing their household activities bites into their household budgets. In other words, the economics of actually undertaking residential energy improvements within homes, and there have been many schemes and they've been quite successful over quite long periods in Canada, but the economics of it now really put this front and center, not only of reducing carbon, but actually reducing the cost of living crisis that so many households face. The problem in all of this is that if we leave this just simply to new insulation and so on, and passive housing to be created by new construction, then new construction between now and 2030 will be about roughly 5% of all households. So that's not fast enough. What then becomes critical is the scale and quality of retrofit activity. Half of Canadian households housing are more than 30 years old, and about a fifth are half a century old. So that retrofitting the technologies, changing the technologies so that they're using either clean electricity or solar power or whatever becomes all the more imperative. And I think that it's quite clear that both the well-being of individuals in terms of their incomes, but also the well-being of all of us in terms of global warming effects is going to be enhanced by faster progress, and that particularly early. I think it's quite likely that because of the economics of all of this and the new technologies and the reduced costs of retrofitting, that there's an imminent triumph here for government in this area of residential energy. That has to be looked at in these terms. It will be a success, although there are a number of inhibiting factors. Many people feel there's a lack of coherent or structured approaches to actually dealing with this issue across different orders of government and indeed within provinces, between cities and provinces and so on. A second consideration is that the capital costs can be quite significant. As suggested, the rising energy prices have really changed the cost benefit so that payback periods of, which used to be 8 to 12 years, and it's now sometimes 4 to 6 years, so that people get the benefits and they get them for a long time, but they have raised costs for a 4 to 6 year period. Now, I think that there are something like a quarter of Canadian households who will find this as a challenge, a budgetary challenge, a cost challenge that they may not be able to meet without some kind of support from government. But it's also clear that most Canadians would benefit from doing this action and moving towards zero carbon sources of fuel, and they would be better off. They just have to bear the pain of paying off the capital cost of their residential improvement over something like 4, 5, 6 year period, possibly longer depending on the terms. So that's about efficient financing. And one can point to various sources of ways in which households could pay for that. Not least would be all the unearned equity that most homeowners are sitting on top of, and ways of recycling that with equity, home equity-based loans to undertake retrofitting might be something that should be a part of policy thinking. There are many other ways that would be more attractive, of course, to homeowners than that particular proposition. There are also then questions about efficient financing and the way in which CMHC and mortgage lenders have to look at questions about energy security in homes. And we'll come back to some of the insurance issues at the end of this. The third issue then is connecting homes, not connecting them to the electricity system, but connecting them to all the activity points that we use around the rural villages or indeed the metropolitan areas that we live in. And as I say, too often this is just seen as a transport-only problem and policy solution. The key issue in dealing with this in Canada is urban form and in other countries, the spatial structure of where homes are and homes are in relation to jobs has a really critical impact on transport emissions of households in going to work and going to play hockey and going to do whatever they're going to do. And in that case, the fact that Canada has this ultra-dispersed population and spends such a high proportion of incomes on travel costs and uses a very high proportion of private transport, i.e. cars, to get there is the problem. Compact city arguments also suggest we could house more population in our metropolitan cores. There would have to travel fewer distances. There's more richer public transport environments and so on. And these are all valid arguments. However, the horse has kind of bolted, at least the last 30, 40 years, the horse has bolted to the suburbs and sometimes the outer suburbs. And Canadian cities don't just have a simple core ring structure. They're a very complicated structure of what are called polycentric centres, sub-centres round about every metropolitan area. And each of them has their own activity centres, activity sites. And understanding that and thinking about it really clearly from a metropolitan level downwards, seeing the metropolitan area as a complex connected set of suburbs is absolutely critical. If you're going to introduce, I make this point not entirely randomly, a policy that was going to link transport investment decisions, housing investment decisions, and infrastructure decisions in Toronto, you would not use municipal boundaries to do it. What you would do would be starting with a functional roadmap that actually identifies the polynucleated settlement structures and movement structures that connect that living city. And if you actually don't think about that and don't use all the rich GIS and other systems that now people have to describe these systems, we have to, if we're going to deal with the environmental issues seriously, we have to govern it seriously. We have to recognize there's a complex environment as a system, but there's also complex places as critical elements in this system. And we have to therefore think about the social shape of the areas we govern. How do we govern them? How do we integrate transport and infrastructure and housing together in that process so that we don't invest by municipal boundaries that reflect the past? We reflect the settlements and structures that are creating the future. I think that governing that and thinking, and including thinking as well as managing, is part of that governing. So understanding the settlement structures we deal with is really important. And within that, of course, we need to think about pattern of neighbourhoods. There's about 10, 15-minute neighbourhoods. Some people say you could attribute it, some of this thinking to Jane Jacobs. It certainly wasn't invented in Paris 15 years ago or the other places that claim. You go back to the Garden City movement that existed in England in the early 1900s. If you think of some of the ideas that existed in France at much the same time, that people have to have their amenity together. Infrastructures within a neighbourhood are really important, of diverse infrastructures. So what is the neighbourhood infrastructure strategy that is actually important, allow people to make activity choices that reduce carbon production, activity choices that they can do from their home base? I actually don't go with the very specifics of the 10, 15-minute city neighbourhood, but the essential idea that for lots of services, it would be a good idea if people had access to them without having to use fossil fuels in the process. There's also important health effects, but we'll leave that to the side. But what I do think, and where I think that argument has been limited, is it needs to be connected. So bigger, and the logic of metropolitan areas and urban areas is that economic activities specialize into particular places and locations for good reasons, so people have to travel to them. Not all neighbourhoods are close to jobs, and even with more working from home, it's important that people can access. So we have to think about neighbourhoods connecting to big system transport. So a combination of 10, 15-minute neighbourhoods and also transport-oriented development to the main economic nodes would probably take us to a better outcome than simply just the 10, 15-minute neighbourhood idea that's being advanced as by planning in particular as ways of shaping housing decisions and infrastructure. It has to think a wee bit more smartly, I think, than we've heard to date. But I do think the ideas that round about that area are going to be really important, and they have to be buried down at metropolitan scales, and they have to involve housing, and they have to involve infrastructure, and they have to involve transport. And I think that that is something that doesn't happen to the extent that one might hope at present time. In other words, I think there are fractures in that area. Last time I talked about the fractures between monetary policy, fiscal policy, infrastructure policy, immigration policy at the federal level. I think at subnational levels, the fractures between housing, infrastructure, transport, planning, and environment are still there, and they need to be addressed fairly urgently. So if we're moving on, and I realise this took me somewhat longer than I meant, I think that if we don't begin to think about a progressive, better governance of housing in this context, if we don't think about housing system and its consequences, we are actually going to make things much worse. And in consequence of that, we're going to get recursive effects from the environment back onto housing in terms of damage from storms, flooding, and so on. And there's going to be all sorts of challenges already for mortgage markets, insurance pricing, and so on, that actually still need to, I think, be somewhat developed. The possibilities of market failures in these markets are quite substantial. Just very quickly then, what about moving on in terms of policy? Well, I think the first thing is that every government department at any level and every housing provider, regardless of size, should actually have an environmental impact statement for what their housing actions are doing. What new housing they're building, what they're refurbishing, just what they're doing by way of managing. What are the main outcomes, certainly in greenhouse gases, but in other areas of carbon, but also in other areas of environment. So that I don't see that. People say that we know all this. Well, if people know all this, it's not reflected in many of the organizational reports that I read. So first thing, we're talking a good game in this area. Let's start to show what housing actually does in terms of its environmental outcomes. The second thing is linking these impacts to a mission statement for every organization that ties into what is trying to achieve in terms of zero carbon and actually more affordable housing at the same time. Everyone talks about zero carbon and affordable housing as if somehow they're handmaidens. They might be, it depends on how we do it. Second thing is at a much higher level and at a fast level, we urgently need a green housing supply commission, actually at federal level, but involving all orders of government, the non-profit sector, the private development sector, and all the range of potentially land interest groups as well. Actually looks at the question of what are we going to do to increase housing supply, but that housing supply is green. It's as zero, it's taking us as quickly and as much towards zero carbon as we possibly can. And I think that will be talking about totals of housing, about decarbonisation. It should be looking at modular homes. It should be looking at reconverting required office accommodation in central cities. There's lots of things which we talk around in the supply issue, but we don't have a coherent feel to it, and the green dimension of it might get lost in some of this. We also need to know more about the economics of retrofit and also the skills that are going to be required to do all of this. In other words, whether you're Department of Finance, whether you're Department of Infrastructure, whether you're Department of Labour, whether you're Environment or Energy, this is a cross-cutting question which is absolutely fundamental. What is green housing supply going to look like? And I think that the federal government, the government of Canada, should establish a high-level commission that reports within a year about what are the 5 key strands of things that need to be done. The policy fractures that I mentioned between green objectives, affordable homes, and skills are a very obvious one, but there are many others. In the context of particular issues for CMHC, they have to provide support and strategic skill support for some of the smaller provinces and potential some of the other more local autonomies to actually develop green housing strategies. We often forget that the number of people involved in planning and planners have often been at the heart of these strategies has actually reduced significantly in Canada in the last 10 years. So where are the strategic skill capacities to put in place the green housing strategies that will also be more affordable? It can be done. We look at the technology, when we look at the potential behavioural changes, and much more needs to be done on that. This can be done, but only if we take it seriously. And finally, I think we need to give urgent thought to the ways in which there can be self-financing of retrofit activity, saying that at a difficult time when people are concerned about the stability of their housing equity values, but also there's the recurrent higher costs of mortgages and so on for people who are not seeing their household budgets rise just as quickly as they had been in the past. So that's a pretty broad challenge. It's a broad sweep. It took much longer than I said, but it's a difficult area to cover. And I think there really has been, in many respects, really good progress. But I also think there have been areas where governance has not yet thought about changing, and it needs to. Thank you.